Ja, ich freue mich, Sie nun alle auch für unser drittes Panel am heutigen Tag zu begrüßen, dem insgesamt 5. Panel dieser Tagung. Dieses Panel wird rein Englisch sein, mit Ausnahme meiner kurzen Einführung hier. Also nutzen Sie gerne wieder die Übersetzung unserer simultanen Dolmetscherinnen. Bei der Gelegenheit einen sehr herzlichen Dank an Gina Stoll und Nora Angles. Und die Kollegin, die gestern da war und morgen wiederkommt. Wir wissen nicht erst seit der gestrigen Diskussion zu Weimar, dass Wirtschaftskrisen, tatsächliche oder gefühlte, eine entscheidende Triebfeder für demokratischen Zerfall sein können. Wenn das nicht nur ein historischer Sonderfall war, welche Zusammenhänge bestehen denn zwischen Wirtschaftskrisen, Diskursen, Wachstumsdiskursen, auf der einen Wirtschaftsstabilität, Wirtschaftssystemen auf der einen Seite und dem Zustand von Demokratien auf der anderen Seite? Wir freuen uns, dieses sehr breite Thema zugegeben, gemeinsam mit Adam Tooze, Dipo Faloyin und Benjamin Zeeb in den Blick zu nehmen. Und der Blick ist sozusagen einerseits sehr konkret auf das Beispiel Nigeria und andererseits immer sehr allgemein im Vortrag von Adam Tooze. Herzlich willkommen, a warm welcome to all of you. Den ersten Vortrag wird Dipo Faloyin vorlegen. Wir haben das auf Wunsch der Referenten nochmal getauscht, falls Sie sich wundern. Also die Variante hier oben ist die stimmt. Dipo, I hope you don't mind that I won't translate your introduction into English. I guess you know your CV quite well anyway. Dipo Faloyin ist in Chicago geboren, in Lagos, Nigeria aufgewachsen und lebt aktuell in London. Er ist Autor und Redakteur des US-amerikanischen Magazins Vice. Seine Artikel behandeln Themen wie Race, Kultur und Identität in Europa und Afrika. Von ihm erschien letztes Jahr das hierzulande viel diskutierte Buch Africa is not a country. Adam Tooze ist Professor und Direktor des Europäischen Instituts an der Columbia University in New York. Er ist einer der weltweit renommiertesten Wirtschaftshistoriker und Public Intellectuals. Seine Bücher wurden mit zahlreichen Preisen ausgezeichnet. Dem deutschen Publikum ist er vermutlich vor allem seit seiner Wirtschaftsgeschichte der NS-Zeit, Ökonomie der Zerstörung, ein Begriff. Zuletzt erschien von ihm Crashed, How a Decade of Financial Crisis Changed the World im Jahr 2018 und 2021 Shutdown, How Covid Shocked the World's Economy. Moderiert wird unsere Diskussion anschließend von Benjamin Zeeb. Er ist Historiker und Demokratie- und Europanetzwerker. Als Mitbegründer des Projekts für Democratic Union und von Alliance for Europe, einem europaweit agierenden Think Tank, setzt er sich mit verschiedenen sozialen, politischen und kulturellen Initiativen für ein demokratisches und vereintes Europa ein. Von ihm erschienen ist unter anderem 2016 der Essay Europa am Abgrund, Plädoyer für die Vereinigten Staaten von Europa. Wir sind sehr gespannt auf dieses Panel.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I should start by apologizing. I don't speak German. I'm Nigerian, and the British got to us first. So I'm terribly sorry. But I will, after this, make more of an effort to try and learn German. Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be here in this incredible institution that does such amazing work and such essential work to talk about fragile democracies. If there's one thing you remember from this talk, then remember this. Nigeria is a country that was built to fail. Modern Africa is a continent that was built essentially to fail. It was built by these men here, men who gathered in 1884 in Berlin at the Berlin Conference to discuss what they wanted to do with this continent. They had sent explorers into the region who came back with a report. And that report said that Africa was a wonderful place, full of incredible natural resources and people and technologies advanced as anywhere else in the world. And as a result, they wanted these incredible resources for themselves. So they decided that they would come together and come up with a process by which they could go and steal these natural resources and steal the land and govern the people by force. They came up with a structure which eventually became the Scramble for Africa, which essentially said that the first person to get there could keep the land for themselves. How you govern the people was entirely up to you. There were two main ways in which these colonial powers, governed the lands. The first was called settler rule. A settler rule involved actually living amongst the people. We see that in South Africa, we see that in Kenya, we saw that in Zimbabwe. But then there was another way, and that way is what I'm going to talk about today, which was called divide and rule. Divide and rule happened in regions of the continent in which the colonialists didn't really want to live because they didn't quite like the weather, they didn't quite like how many mosquitoes were there, so they wanted nothing to do with actually living there. So what they did was that they created a system by which they didn't have to actually be there for them to be able in some way to rule this land. A divide and rule started by creating these countries in the first place. Now what we have here is rough outlines of the map of Africa plus the outlines of the 54 countries. Those little dots you see around represent each individual ethnic group. These were the ethnic groups that existed before the Berlin Conference. Each blob represents a community that existed as one single community before the colonialism happened. Now what the British especially did was that they decided that they would take those individual communities and they would force them to live amongst other communities and other communities until you had a comically large country. A country like Nigeria, for example. Nigeria is a country of 200 million people. Nigeria is a country that has 500 languages in one country. Now you can just imagine if you were to design a country, you'd probably avoid trying to put as many different languages as possible together. You'd probably avoid forcing ethnic groups that had a history of going to war with each other into one country. You'd ask who worshipped which gods. You'd ask about traditions and their backgrounds. And you try and make something that meant peace would last for generations and generations. But what the colonialists were trying to do was they were trying to do the opposite. They were trying to create chaos and tension and strife within these countries. They did this because they figured that if you had a country that spoke in lots and lots of different languages, worshipped lots and lots of different gods, then they would find it hard to come together to fight back. That was the tactic that they developed. And it worked. These people were suddenly forced to be a part of a country that they had no interest in. But not only that, they were surrounded by other citizens that they had no history with. And in many cases, they had difficult histories with some communities. And that created the tension and the strife and the violence that the British intended especially, and many of the other colonialists wanted in their regions. Which is why in many African countries you have so much of this division and strife that occurred throughout their history. And divide and rule not only was a policy of putting lots of people together, but after you did that, the aim was to find a few unscrupulous people, people who were slick to a bribe, the worst amongst this group of people, someone who was likely uneducated. And then you would empower that person, and you would give them money, and you would train them up, and you would give them guns and arms, and you would put that person in charge, the worst amongst us. And you would tell them, go out into your land, and the more strife and pain and violence you introduce, the more money we will give you. Go and spread lies and disinformation about other ethnic groups. Tell one ethnic group that they're lesser than another ethnic group. Cause as much division and chaos as you can. And after that, you will have this land to yourself forever and ever. That's certainly what the British did in Nigeria. Nigeria is split, as I said, across about 500 different ethnic groups. And the British targeted 3 ethnic groups, the 3 largest of the ethnic groups. The Hausas in the north, the Igbos in the southeast. So this is a slightly closer look at Nigeria. So the Hausas in the north, the Igbos in the southeast, and the Yorubas in the southwest. And after spending a bit of time with all these different ethnic groups, the British picked their favorite ones. They picked the Hausas in the north. And they empowered as many of the Hausas as possible to govern over the rest of the region. These individuals that they would empower were called big men. Now, these big men became incredibly influential in these communities. All power went to them. And it was easy to subjugate the rest of their country. Because as you can see from this map, and this is Nigeria, just how divided these people were. Each color map, each different blob represents an entirely different community that would have existed on its own if colonialism had never happened, and could, to today, still exist. And these big men ruled for most of colonialism. You can imagine just how much power that would give someone. From 1884 right up until the 1960s. And then independence came. And the colonialists left. But guess who didn't leave? The big men. As far as they were concerned, it was their country. They had all the money, they had the military training, but there were so many of them. You couldn't just have one big man. You had to empower as many as you can across the country. And so you had big men in the north, big men in the southeast, big men in the southwest. This is replicated across Africa. And in those early years after independence, what you had across many countries was a fight to be the ultimate big man, the president of this country, this new country, a country that is now independent, but it has no particular history, no real culture as one big nation. My parents are older than Nigeria itself, so you can understand just how short this history is. And so after independence, these countries had to establish some sense of national identity, some sense of who are we exactly? What should our national anthem be? What should our national traditions be? National colors, mottos, all these things. And many people wanted to get on with that work, but all those big men cared about was the promise that had been given to them, that this would be your country. And so these big men who spread across the country essentially went to war with each other. In the case of Nigeria and the Nigerian Civil War, you had the big men in the southeast, the Igbos, killed a couple of big men in the north and took charge. And so a few big men in the north, you can imagine, decided to retaliate and killed some big men in the southeast. But not only that, they started to kill random people, to assert their authority, to say, never again will you lay your hands on our big men. And what followed was the Nigerian Civil War. What followed was an incredibly fragile democracy. It's the perfect term for a country like Nigeria. A fragile democracy. A country that is essentially built to fail. Eventually you'd get a winner, and that person would become president, which has been the case in Nigeria. The vast majority of Nigeria's presidents, especially during military rule, were the Hausas in the north, who had been favored by the British. And these big men did not have much support around the country. So they had two options that worked simultaneously. Number one was to make their own people as rich as possible, to get support primarily from just their own ethnic group. And then the second option was to maintain ties with those who had empowered them in the first place, the colonialists. And the colonialists were interested in maintaining ties, especially during the Cold War, when the Americans especially, and the Russians, and large parts of Europe wanted friends, and they were willing to pay for friends. And these big men were certainly willing to be bought. So you go from a fragile democracy into discussions around international economics. What are the civilians of these countries meant to do? It became harder and harder to shift these big men out of office because they were being empowered through trade deals and all sorts to stay in power, because them remaining in power was in the best interests of the Western world. The big men relied on their foreign backers in many of these cases to hold on to as much power as possible. There's an example of that today in Rwanda. I don't know if this has made much news, but currently one big British policy in Rwanda is to send migrants in the UK from the British government, is to send migrants and asylum seekers to Rwanda. Incredibly controversial policy in the UK, one in which many of the courts have since rejected. And in exchange for that, Rwanda gets money, as you can imagine. Now, Rwanda is currently being run by a man called Paul Kagame, who is essentially on his third term of his presidency and has decided that he'd quite like to govern for the rest of his life. So it works out pretty well for him. He strikes a deal with the UK. He agrees in theory to take migrants, though he knows that the courts will never allow these migrants to come, but he gets the money. They get to build accommodation that will eventually be used for his own people. And while this agreement continues, then the British are not going to say anything about his desire to stay in power forever. This is how global economics and global agreements have worked to impact these fragile democracies. Many young people are trying to have a greater impact on their countries, on these young countries, on setting the future. Remember, these countries are incredibly young. We're talking about independence in the 1960s. Many of these big men who were knocking around during the Civil War are still vying for power today. And you have a generation of young people who are trying to gain back their own country from these men, but are finding it incredibly difficult, because many of these economic agreements, money being poured into these countries, are being siphoned off to these big men and being used to stay in power. In the 1980s and in the 1990s, you had aid campaigns that were introduced into the equation. And suddenly the world was seeing pictures of starving children, destitute, in poverty. And as a result, money flew in quickly into these countries, flooded these countries, and that money was mismanaged and misused to keep these strong men in office, making these democracies even more fragile, making that confusion even more difficult. And we've seen that last right up until now. One of the biggest investments currently across the continent is coming from China as part of their Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative. Their interest isn't the same as with colonialism in the sense of wanting to come in and take over the country and run it themselves, but they also see that there's an opportunity to buy friends here. And many of these individuals are willing, as they've always have been, to take this money and entrench their power. We saw it recently in the Nigerian elections, where there were three main candidates. The ruling party's candidate is from Lagos, where my family are from. Lagos is there. The main opposition party candidate is from a state just up there, by Kaduna. And the third party candidate is a young man, relatively young man, relative to these other men, he's 60. You can understand how traumatic the experience of Nigerian politics is when I'm saying that to a young man, called Peter Obi, who is from this area here. Three main candidates. One from the southeast, one from the southwest, one from the north. Those divisions are still there. And many of them, apart from Peter Obi in the southeast, but the two other main candidates have been involved in national politics now for as long as my parents can remember. And one of the candidates is from, as I mentioned, from Lagos. Lagos is the most populous city of 20 million people. And his main claim to the presidency was to say, look at how much incredible infrastructure has been built in our city. Look at what I did for our city. Now, much of that money and much of that investment has come from China, who've built roads and railroads and all sorts of different initiatives in this one city. Now, the question is, what does that actually entail into the future? What does that really mean in the long run? And it's hard to say. That initiative has put Lagos as a city, which is meant to be the economic powerhouse of the country, into immense debt. Debt that there's just no way the city could ever pay back. So what have they sold, is the question. And that's the question that Africa has had to endure for a long time with these leaders. What exactly is being sold? When aid money comes in, what exactly goes out? How are these democracies constantly affected? And it won't change in the near future. The main opposition party have held on to the governorship the ruling party have held on to the governorship in Lagos, and the ruling party have won the presidency. And in 4 years' time, they will say the same thing. That look at all the roads and all the bridges that have been built. And that is the challenge facing many of these fragile democracies. If you shut off some of that money, the money that is being used as a way to win elections and to entrench your power, then many of these rulers, as the third party candidate in the southeast, who was supported by many of the young people, has said, will force leaders to look internally, to win support based on the work that they're doing within their country. But that's the challenge for many of these developing nations. And it's not an easy one because there still remains so many big men to push aside. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. I have to say that, like so many other people that I've heard speaking today, I am a Mensch mit Migrationshintergrund, though obviously indisputably very white. And I actually sitting there realizing that after decades, in fact my entire life, seeking to pass as a German speaker, native German speaker, I'm profoundly uncomfortable up here speaking in English. It's maybe the first time in my adult life I've given a talk in Germany in English, my native language. So it's a very fascinating experience provoked by this fascinating conference that we've assembled here. And I realize I have a job to do, which is at some point somebody realized you're doing a big session on fragile democracies, and in each individual case the economy plays a role, but somebody needs to talk about capitalism. Somebody needs to talk about the economy, and Tooze is the die for that. So here I am. And I am going to talk about the economy, but actually the broader point that I want to make is something more abstract, which is about the relationship between structure and agency, between history and the choices that we make in the present, and the way in which narratives shape the space that we have open for us. There's an interesting parallel between the dynamic of the previous panel, where we had NATO giving this powerful testimony, essentially, to the ongoing violence and racism of the situation in Namibia, and Dipo has repeated that move with regard to Nigeria. And on the other hand, that dizzying, bewildering display of brilliance of a different kind that we had from Mark, trying to account for the shifting scene of democracy and plurality and diversity in modern Germany. In a sense, I'm going to repeat that move in relation to what Dipo's just said. Because I'm going to start with crisis. This is where Michael Wild and other people took you yesterday. This is Germany's interwar history, the period between the wars. And you see there the two economic crises of the interwar period. The first is a period of hyperinflation, which is the crisis that Germany's democracy survived, in fact, used the inflation to get through the aftermath of the war. And then the crisis which actually felled German democracy, which is a crisis of unemployment and deflation. And so if you were thinking about the sort of, and this is the puzzle that I really want to start with, if you were thinking about the sort of lessons that the economic policymakers of a democracy would learn from that interwar experience in Germany, you would think that, looking at this experience, they would prioritize avoiding deflation and minimizing unemployment as the actual drivers of the collapse of democracy in Germany in the early 1930s. But as I say that, you will realize that this is not the case. Germany's political economy, West Germany's political economy, now that of the Federal Republic, and through Germany, progressively also European institutions as well, have a near pathological obsession with the avoidance of the inflation, which in fact was crucial to the survival of German democracy in the early 1920s. Now that is a sobering realization, and many of us spend our time in a state of uproar and furious indignation at this fact and hammering on the doors of policymakers. I've given speeches in Munich saying, who's afraid of inflation? We shouldn't be afraid of inflation. You could draw the conclusion, after all, a cynic would, that maybe German economic policymakers aren't that serious about democracy at all. Right? Because if the bigger threat is actually unemployment and deflation, why aren't they focused on the main thing? That is one interpretation, and I'm not going to dismiss it. It's actually quite serious. And in the critique of neoliberalism, that is one of the strands, that we have a political economic regime that prioritizes the interests of bondholders, fundamentally, of certain sorts of wealth. But I'm going to offer you a more charitable interpretation, which is that perhaps, well, A, people don't know any economics, and certainly we know they don't know very much history. And if you put those two things together, you could end up with the results of a survey that was done by a brilliant group of quite young German researchers 5 years ago now, which is this. Now, it's a little technical, so let me explain it. But what they basically did was to ask a group of contemporary Germans in the 2010s what they thought the inflation rate was in the 1930s. Now, the correct answer is negative 10%. Right? Because that's what a deflation is. And a deflation is terrible because it devalues the assets against which debts are secured. Imagine if Munich property prices collapsed by 50% tomorrow. How would the bourgeoisie of Munich be feeling about their portfolios on Monday morning? That's a deflation and why it's really bad. If you actually asked Germans 5 years ago what they thought the inflation rate in the 1930s was, the overwhelming majority of Germans in the believed that the problem of the 1930s, of the Great Depression that opened the door to Hitler, was inflation. So in fact, there is a fundamentally post-factual, fake truth understanding of what was going on in Germany at the time, which in a sense is a relief, because if you think that it was the cause, then the current obsession with inflation is less anti-democratic than it seems. In other words, if you have a sufficiently muddled view of history, right, you actually may be a good, devout Democrat and simply believe that price stability is the alpha and omega of social stability, without which there cannot be democratic peace. But the question, of course, that forces itself on us as critical historical thinkers and people who, Zeitgenossen in the German sense, people who navigate the contemporary world, is that we are inhabited by, we're surrounded by ghosts, essentially made-up realities which are not the world. How do you end up there? And this is where this issue of storytelling, of narrative, comes in, because clearly what is the case is not that contemporary Germans actually have physical, personal experience of the 1920s or the 1930s. That's not the case, right? These notions about history move forward through to the present in lots of different ways, and that's really what I want to open up a conversation about in the remarks that follow. How the memory of how history functions in debates about the economy in democracies. And one of the things that's clearly gone on in the German case is that a huge amount of work has gone into the process of fashioning a memory. And saying that in an institution like this is a matter of self-evidence. That's why we're here. We're at a place in which memory and historical work is done. And the fact that we're here, the fact literally that I came here, also signifies something about the stakes that are involved, because being committed to a narrative is a sort of personal commitment. I came because this is the NS-Dokumentationszentrums. I grew up in West Germany in the 70s and 80s. I feel an obligation to the project of Vergangenheitsbewältigung. We know it's hit hard times. It needs all the support it can possibly get. Uli Herbert was showing up. Michael Wild was showing up. Stephanie Middendorf was showing up. So I was going to show up too. It's not what I do anymore. I'm a million miles remote from Nazi history. But we're here to preach, right? There are things that need saying. It's important to stay engaged with this project. And that self-same logic motivates the other people on the side of this story, namely the Bundesbank, who have worked incredibly hard for decades and decades and decades to pitch to the German population the story of inflation as the curse that destabilizes modern societies. Now, if you want to read a book about this, it's a great piece of archival excavation by Simon Mee. It is, however, an Anglophone book about German monetary policy. So you might be thinking this is another instance of British and American economists dumping on German economists as provincial, Hinterwäldler, who don't understand modern capitalism. So let me just show you something to demonstrate what I'm talking about here. This, I kid you not, is you can see it, Die Tour zur Stabilitätskultur. This is a 2022 bus tour, in fact it's a truck tour by the Bundesbank, to remind Germans of the anti-inflationary foundations of the society, the hugely successful, prosperous, and increasingly diverse and interesting society that we all are benefiting from the hospitality of this afternoon. It's for real, right? They built this thing. They've even anthropologized themselves. They've turned an economic policy choice into a culture. Yeah, it's a culture. You live within it. If you're German, you're just part of this culture. We all know the power politics you can play with this kind of anthropologization. You can translate it into a power map. This is one of those German Handbücher of economics, which don't exist anywhere else. We have textbooks. People make millions writing them. In German, you have Handbücher, and one of these Handbücher issues you this power map. And it's really telling, right? Because stability culture anchors price stability and the anti-inflationary policy. Stability culture also severely constrains democratic sovereignty, because if you've got a stability culture orientated, you can see here, if you've got a stability culture orientated central bank, elections, parliaments don't come into this picture of economic policy. It's made somewhere else and it's anchored in culture. So that goes deep, right? That goes deep into people's bones. It's what they wake up with every morning. It's the milieu that they sleep in. It's the language they speak. And it's also, of course, in the German case, undeniably profoundly popular. So this is not something that's just merely, a sort of figment of false consciousness. It's quite deep, though it does produce false consciousness. Remember, it's hard to describe people's beliefs about the 1930s anyway. Other way, it's literally fake. It also, in fact, overwrites Germany's own history. So moments like this are literally unimaginable for stability culture. This is Helmut Schmidt, for crying out loud, the most right-wing of the 1970s Social Democrats, when he was finance minister, saying what? Lieber 5% Inflation als 5% Arbeitslosigkeit. Now just imagine that trade-off now. You would rather have 5% inflation than 5% unemployment? Helmut Schmidt, Orton, early 1970s. That was the bandwidth that German political economy once had. Clearly not admissible in a stability-orientated culture, because by the time you're out at 5%, your culture's fraying at the margins, right? This thing is becoming profoundly unstable. So stability culture constrains choice, anchors itself in the population, rewrites history. It also runs into systemic problems. Because capitalism, in fact, occasionally demands people do things which are really rather radical and not very stability-orientated at all. Or rather, it's so unstable that the counteracting forces that you need to mobilize are ad hoc. We've seen it literally over the last 2 weekends, first in the United States, 10 in Switzerland. You break all the rules. The Americans have escape clauses in all of their financial regulation legislation. It's positively Schmittian. It really reminds you of 1920s Weimar. We do this until we don't anymore, and who will decide is the sovereign. Who will decide is some combination of the FDIC, the Treasury, the Fed, and the administration. So, lo and behold, moments like this happen. From the point of view of most analysts who think about the European economy, this is the moment of saving grace. Almost literally from the vertical came the assertion of sovereign power by Mario Draghi. We will do whatever it takes. And then he looks the hedge funders in the eyes. He pauses and he goes, and believe me, it will be enough. Apparently he was really pissed off. Mario Draghi is a mild-mannered Italian upper-class elite. The guy is pretty cool most of the time. He'd spent too long around the Eurosceptic London bankers. He wanted to deliver the message. Look at the video. It's really quite something. Here is sovereign power speaking. But it's profoundly destabilizing to stability culture, and then it suddenly emerges that stability culture has more than just stability going for it. It also has guard dogs. So the AfD, ladies and gentlemen, as you well know, didn't start life as an anti-immigrant, anti-Islamic party. It started life as an anti-Draghi party. In defense of stability culture. That was its original theme, was defending culture. And it isn't, of course, just the crazes of the AfD, it's the Bild-Zeitung. This was Bild-Zeitung, the major vast tabloid coverage of Mario Draghi's position. This was 2015, towards the end of his tenure, maybe slightly later. And they don't stop at Italians. You might think this was all about Italian ethnicity, but this is their treatment of Isabel Schnabel in 2021-2022. This is the German, unimpeachably orthodox German representative on the ECB board. The fascinating thing here, and this is where I converge with Mark, is that you don't just have to sit with this. So the extraordinary thing that happened is that Germany's leading representative on the ECB board turned on the German tabloids, not just the tabloids. This, believe it or not, is a slide from the ECB's slide deck in which Isabel Schnabel turns on, you can see it there, the Spiegel, Bild, Focus, Tagesspiegel, FATS is in there anyway, and then you've got Hans-Werner Sinn, and says, stop it. What you are doing is constraining the ability of the ECB to manage monetary policy with this panic-maker, with this panic-mongering around inflation. So this culture, it turns out, is fragile, contested, open-ended, battled over at all different levels, at the level of the popular, at the level of the Springer media, which is popular but hardly populist, or populist but not genuinely popular from the bottom up, but also from the top down. Indeed, and this is really where the first part of my story wraps, think about the folks who produced that paper which allowed me to start with my amazing opener. This is a group of blue-blooded Germans, one of them is called Rommel for crying out loud, who at the Hertie School, at the core of the new German power establishment in Berlin, authored this paper to try and make sense of the perverse fake news misunderstandings of their own fellow citizens. Right, so you see here exactly what Mark is talking about, this continuous self-problematization of a sophisticated modern democracy that takes its own fake narratives and problematizes them, or like you were saying, Dipo, the remarkable work that young cohorts of African journalists are doing in trying to summon up the forces of conscience and just common sense, right, reason against the absurdities of big men politics. You could also, however, say, because money's not innocent stuff, that this is the latest phase in the Americanization of German policy culture. Because money is a power hierarchy, it's a global power hierarchy. And when the folks at the Hertie School are tearing their hair out because they can't understand why the Germans are so crazy about inflation, they're not doing it because they're leftist progressives. They're doing it because they don't understand why the governance of German capitalism, and by way of Germany, that of Europe, is so screwed up. They want to understand why it's so dysfunctional. And the example that they have in mind is the United States, because the United States has the reverse understanding of what monetary policy is about. The United States actually remembers the Great Depression as what it was. In the policy discourse of the United States and in the popular understanding of the Great Depression, it's understood as a deflation, not an inflation. So the function of a central bank in the United States is not to shrink the money supply to prevent prices running away, it's to ensure that the money supply never shrinks. Demonstration of this the other weekend in Silicon Valley. The one thing that cannot be allowed to happen is Silicon Valley about to simply crash, because that will implode the money supply in the innovative hub of the United States economy. Now, this isn't an innocent narrative either. All narratives come from somewhere. All of them are subject to politics. And this one is literally the product of probably the most influential coupling of historians in United States history. They're not even historians, but it's Anna Schwartz and Milton Friedman, who in their Monetary History of the United States, published in the early 1960s, rewrote the history of their nation in terms of the equation MV equals PT. And what that equation does is link M, the quantity of money, to P, the level of prices. And what they showed was, according to their own narrative, that the greatest threat, the greatest challenge, the greatest collapse of American capitalism and the greatest threat to American democracy came from the failure of the central bank to ensure that the money supply did not implode. The precise reverse of the lesson, if you like, that sits inside the DNA of the Bundesbank, and with the Bundesbank then the early ECB until Mario Draghi came along. And this lesson is literally repeated down as a mantra, no less ritualistically than in the German case. This, I kid you not, is Ben Bernanke at Milton Friedman's 90th birthday party in Chicago, of course, declaring, I would like to say Milton and Anna. So Ben Bernanke at this point is a junior official in the Fed board in the United States. He's also the leading economist of his generation in the Fed board. He's sent to represent the Fed at the birthday of Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz having blamed the Fed for the crisis of the Great Depression. And the message from Bernanke to them on Milton Friedman's birthday is, I would like to say Milton and Anna, regarding the Great Depression, you're right, we did it, the Fed screwed up, we're very sorry, but thanks to you, we won't do it again. Literally repeated down as a story about how to govern capitalism as a mantra that you learn and imbibe and make into the ramrod, really, of your economic policy understanding, the staff that you cling to at the moment of crisis. And man, did Ben Bernanke cling to it in 2008. He became the great money-making, cash, liquidity-generating machine par excellence in the history of capitalism up to that point. Celebrated by Time magazine on the one hand as the man of the year, by Atlantic more ambiguously as I believe this is one of the weirdest superheroes who's sort of popular or not. I'm not really very good at the Marvel universe. But anyway, Ben Bernanke had an ambiguous reputation. And you might ask, why ambiguous? Because isn't Ben Bernanke learning the right lesson from the 1930s? Isn't he our hero? Surely he is our hero. He's the one who actually understands what did happen in the 1930s. He's not victim to fake news. The reason, of course, is that beyond ideas, beyond political culture, beyond this surging back and forth of narratives, there are also handfeste Interessen, right? Fundamental material interests that motivate decision-making. And it was perfectly clear that what Ben Bernanke was engaged in 2008 was the bailout of Wall Street. What was involved here in this policy, and this is also the flip side, this is also the integrity of the German position, is you let them burn. Right? In German vision of central banking, one of the things you do is just simply let them burn down. That is the one thing that an American central banker who understands themselves as a steward of the interests of the capitalist system will never, ever do. And 10 years later, Bernanke, Paulson, and Geithner found themselves saying they bailed out Wall Street. No one can deny they did, but why did they do it? They did it to help Main Street. So they are engaged in a debate on the terrain of democracy about the priorities of public institutions and trying to balance the intellectual lineage, the massive pressures which are coming from Wall Street, discursively defending themselves still 10 years after the event. And there's a third element, which is, as it were, wraps my three elements in the story, if you like, of the way in which democracies, Germany and the United States, deal with histories of crisis, internalize them. One element is the dimension of ideas, of traditions, of discourses that are repeatedly, literally in the case of Bernanke, you were right, we were wrong, we won't do it again. It's like a mantra. You say it every night before you go to bed as the chair of the Fed. There is the dimension of power and of interest, and then there is finally the dimension of interest, of institutions. Because a third way in which the Federal Reserve is different from the Bundesbank and now the ECB is the Federal Reserve has what's called a dual mandate. It's a central bank which simultaneously is required to maintain price stability and maximum employment. So imagine if the ECB had this mandate during the Eurozone crisis, it would not have been allowed to preside over the surge of unemployment in Greece to 1930s levels. It would not have been allowed to preside over Spanish youth unemployment in the 30s and 40s. It would have been a Mandatsverletzung. It would have been a violation of its principal purpose. That is built into the Fed's mandate. So how did that come about? What is its history? Well, one story you could tell is that it's the result of the last dying breaths of Keynesianism in the United States in the 1970s. The Humphrey Hawkins bill, which mandates the Fed to stabilize both prices and unemployment, dates to 1978. It was signed into law by Jimmy Carter being the last, well, he's in fact the progenitor and the door opener to neoliberalism, but the Democratic Party at the time contained a left-wing coalition that was solidly Keynesian, in fact adventurously Keynesian, and was in the business of trying to do konzertierte Aktion in the German sense, so corporatist macroeconomic management at the global level. This was the heyday of the G7, where we had the locomotive theory of Germany, Japan, and the United States sucking the world economy. This was Helmut Schmidt's great stage that he would strut on as Germany's macroeconomic chancellor. But if you dig deeper into the 1970s and 60s and 70s and the history of economic policy making in the United States, you actually see something else. And if you look at the faces of the people arrayed behind Jimmy Carter at this point, you already get a hint, because the signing ceremony for major legislation in the United States is a major ceremonial moment. And if you go back into the history of the Democratic Party in the 60s and 70s and ask who it was prioritizing legislative action to ensure that government authorities were mandated to achieve maximum employment, you find yourself here. This is the great famous March on Washington. This is the march at which Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. And what has been buried in a certain sort of liberal history of the civil rights movement is that, as you can see here, the demand for the empowerment of the black population, the completion of American democracy, always combined, and in Martin Luther King's personally, in his mind, always combined two elements. As it says there in black and white, civil rights plus full employment equals freedom. Civil rights by themselves are not freedom, in other words. Full employment, obviously not. Civil rights plus full employment are freedom. And from the 60s onwards, once the basic political and legal position of African Americans was secured by the Voting Act and by the civil rights legislation of the period, the civil rights movement shifts its emphasis to socioeconomic issues. It's not by accident that Martin Luther King is gunned down while he is supporting a garbage workers' mobilization, because he is at that point launching the Poor People's Campaign, which is to carry the civil rights movement into its later phase. In the late 1960s, the civil rights movement collaborated with the most left-wing American Keynesians to draft a freedom budget, which literally called for the full employment guarantee, a concerted drive to abolish poverty. And if you look back to this picture here, and you look at the right-hand side, and you see this figure here, that's Coretta Scott King. That's Martin Luther King's widow. This is the inspiring social activist of really, by American standards, very far-left opinions, who Martin Luther King wooed at college in the 1950s, to whom he, and with whom, he thought through his social radicalism, and who carried his message on, and indeed her own, and the broader socio-economic agenda of the civil rights movement into the 1970s. And again, let's make the move. Why do we know this? How do we know this now? Now, in the 60s and 70s, this was common knowledge, because you was in the moment. President Carter asks Coretta Scott King to attend, because he understands the legacy that he's honoring. But I can tell you, I grew up in economic history and economic policy debate through the 80s, 90s, 2000s. I knew that the Americans had a dual mandate. I had no idea why they had a dual mandate. The reason why we do know are publications like this. And this is what I would call the democratic iteration, borrowing a phrase from Shayla Ben-Habib. This is the intellectual mobilization that was driven forward in the United States from 2010 onwards by Black Lives Matter, by the mobilization against Trump, by what became the Green New Deal, by the George Floyd protests following 2020, which transformed America's debate on the left about economic policy and forced this into the agenda. The point I'm trying to make here, a little bit like Mark, is that we have to think of these rather than as fixed processes. We have to think of this as a continuous problematization of historical reality. And these are the analogues, if you like, to those folks at the Hertie School who are trying to understand why German misunderstandings of economic policy are so twisted. And the extraordinary thing about this is that it has effects. It has effects. So, in the summer of 2020, in the summer of George Floyd, as the American political system was tearing itself apart over the second wave of Black Lives Matter, the Fed decided to line up on the right side of history. The Fed, the central bank. In August 2020, the Fed under Jerome Powell redefined its goal of maximum employment as being broad-based and inclusive. For the first time, it would look beyond the overall unemployment rate and also consider the jobless rates for black and Hispanic workers in setting interest rates. Fed officials hope that keeping rates down would enable this to happen. It's an incredible shift in the discourse of economic policy from a blindness to the evident fact of massive racial disadvantage in the American labor market. The last people into jobs in the American economy in a business cycle are black men, and the first people out are black men. Business cycle policy is racial justice policy, and the Fed is in fact acknowledging this in black and white. So much so that not out of any kind of commitment to woke politics, but simply because they need to understand what the Fed is doing, Wall Street has begun to follow very, very closely black male unemployment. Because we know it's part of the dashboard of Fed decision-making at this point. Now, does it guarantee any particular outcome? No. Does it obviate the need for continuous struggle on these issues? Evidently not. But has something happened here? Something that from the European point of view is well now unfathomable. Imagine if the ECB was mandated to track the unemployment rate of the most disadvantaged migrant groups in the Eurozone. Systematically mandated to do it. That is what the Fed has chosen to do in the wake of the 2020 protests. And that's what enables what I think is really, in the history of financial journalism, a truly astonishing image that I'll leave you with. So this is the Financial Times, the most influential global financial newspaper, saying that higher black unemployment poses a test for the Fed's goal to be more inclusive. This is from early 2022. And what is the image they choose? A young black woman going to work in front of the Statue of Liberty in New York City. You can see here the concatenation of images of freedom and empowerment that actually are making their way as a result of these struggles inside the policy-making apparatus, over the history and over the understanding of how economic policy works, into even places like the Financial Times. Is this as a panacea? Does this solve the problem? Does this in any way by itself shift the parameters? Clearly not. But what it does indicate is the creativity in the space that certain sorts of smart activism can actually generate, even in societies as closed as the United States. Thank you very much. I look forward very much to the conversation.
I guess I'll take one of those. All right, quite a lot to unpack, and I think given that those are two very different approaches and two very different presentations, I don't think we can expect to really tie everything perfectly together. This is not going to be a symphony. Let's think of it more like jazz, and let's try to give everybody a bit of a beat. If you're feeling tired by now, or if you think it's a bit cramped here, just remember it's very appropriate that we would remember 1923 and the beer hall putsch in a cellar and in a basement with no light. Thank you very much for the invitation. I really, really, truly appreciate it. I know everybody always says this, but in this context, I must say with two so brilliant, not only writers, but as we saw, also presenters. It comes from the heart. We learned that essentially Germans know nothing, right? They know nothing about Africa. They know nothing about economics. And then, if you think about it really, everybody else also knows nothing. There's no reason. And the best thing we can hope for is that somebody's ideology just very sort of approximates reality and gives them a reason to do something that makes sense. I want to come briefly to a topic, Dipo, that I know is very close to your heart, and then move closer to the economic relationships and the fragility of democracies. You speak a lot about how this not knowing anything, especially about Africa, is a major problem. It's a major problem for Africa. I would argue it will become a major problem for us as well, as Africa will become increasingly more important in our own economic development. We are trying to look into the future and build this new green, bright future where everything is automated and green cars, battery-driven cars drive around. But obviously, again, and this will sound familiar, Europeans will need the raw materials to build up these economic processes. There's not much left in the east to go to. Chile is very far. So Africa is, unfortunately, and I'm very sorry about that, the place that we will turn to once again. And the other reason is that we're currently running an experiment where we're going to see what happens when you run out of 30 and 40-year-olds. We're actually going to need a lot of people to maintain our economies, and again, Africa will be an obvious place to go in that sense. Now, all of this is happening under these conditions of us not really understanding the place, and I would argue that this is not really only our fault. It is in a great sense structural. One of my best friends, actually, he's going to go to Africa. He's going to go to Cape Town, like many of us do. And he is going to be the foreign correspondent for Süddeutsche Zeitung, for one of the biggest daily newspapers here. And when he does so, he will be there essentially all by himself. There's no office to speak of. And he's going to be responsible to report, and I have to chuckle saying this, everything, I think, south of the Democratic Republic of Congo or something. It's not a one-woman job, obviously. And then he's a good journalist. He will try his best. Like, this guy is real. And he's going to work with people on the ground and so on. And he's going to try. But then also he's going to hang around at the consulate with the people from the New York Times and Heinrich Böll Foundation and the people you hang out with when you go to Cape Town. It just can't be helped. So it's impossible. It's impossible. Like we completely lack the foundations to be able to have a sensible discussion about, let alone like Africa, let alone Nigeria. So where do you see a point of, to remedy this, structural issue that could empower us to actually be able to hold a conversation that makes sense?
Yeah. So the simple answer is education. And I'll go back slightly because you mentioned that it's a structural issue, and it's one that actually started at the Berlin Conference. Now, it was illegal then as it is now to go into someone else's land and steal it for yourself. So a key part of the meeting was to come up with some sort of justification as to why they could go about stealing this land. And what they decided on was that they would tell the rest of the world that Africans were savages, that they were uncivilized, that they couldn't look after themselves. And so what they needed was what the Europeans were going to introduce, which is what they called the 3 Cs, which is commerce, Christianity, and civilization to these people. Now, of course, they knew that this was a lie, that this was a land that was as technologically advanced as anywhere else in the world, that it had incredible natural resources, but more importantly, the people were as diverse as anyone else in the world, and there are so many rich communities with incredible histories. But they decided on this lie, and that they would tell this lie, and that's exactly what they did. And that lie has essentially survived up until now, where if you ask most people around the world to sort of close their eyes and picture Africa, they think of one of 2 things, either poverty or safari, and nothing else. We're either all poor, or we have lions and tigers roaming around our gardens as pets. And so this is the myth that's been allowed literally to spread since a meeting in Berlin in 1884 right up until today. And it has been allowed to spread because our education system doesn't teach about the Berlin Conference. I can certainly speak for the UK. I do a number of talks around the country, and I ask audiences, have you ever heard of the Berlin Conference? And you might get 2 or 3 or 4 hands up. Most people have never heard of the Berlin Conference. They've never heard of, what King Leopold II did in what was then the Congo Free State. They've never heard about the way in which these countries were created, and much of what we talked about today. And so they see Africa as just this one big country of singular experiences, and which is why it has always been so easy for foreign publications like the New York Times and Guardians to send a correspondent to one particular part of Africa and say, right, you go and cover Africa, and you are now our African correspondent. You've never even been to Africa, but it doesn't really matter. There isn't much sort of diversity in people and thoughts and ideas and cultures. They're all fairly similar to each other. So you just go ahead and cover what these, funny people are up to. And that's really been the history. And what really shifts things is when you start to teach about colonialism, and you start to teach about the impact that the Berlin Conference and different specific rules had, whether it was, the German rule was very different to Belgian rule, which is different to French rule, which is different to German rule. And you're getting that so much more in a generation of young people who are genuinely curious about this history. And when they start learning about this stuff, they start to ask the best questions about the impact that this had on the people in these countries. And suddenly they no longer see Africa as this singular place. I called my book very literally, Africa is not a country, to get that point across. And you start to become curious about this region. You start to appreciate the diversity. So I think the most important thing is education, and the work of institutions like this, and putting memory at the heart of building our future societies, to say, look, what has come in the past? What has actually happened? Let's understand that so that we can ensure that we don't make those same mistakes in the future.
I'm, in a small way, passionately interested in this question, because I'm totally convinced that Africa will have a decisive role in the next 20 to 30 years of global affairs. And I'm painfully aware, and I think this is also a generational thing. If you look back In the 60s and 70s, there was in fact a very widespread interest in African politics and economics in the West, certainly on the European and American left, because the post-colonial moment was dramatic. It totally changed the complexion of the UN, and the Cold War was played out there in really dramatic style. And I think one of the problems that we have is, as it were, the structural failure to teach the history of colonialism back to the 19th century sits within another failure, which is in a sense to address the historicity of Africa's crisis in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, which after all was not the state of the newly independent countries. Nigeria is a particularly tragic history in the 1960s, but if you look at Ghana, for instance, if you look at Kenya, these were vibrant hubs both of economic activity, of commercial activity, and of extremely popular culture. This was before the age of Islamic fundamentalism, so you had an extraordinary vibrant disco scene, music scene that translated out of the continent to the wider world. And I think one of the tasks that we have to do in the current age is to dig ourselves out, if you like, out of that period of really profound crisis in the late stages of the Cold War, and when African industrialization stalled, economic development stalled, and the AIDS epidemic swept across both the male and female populations of Africa. In a sense, we're now in a period of recovery from that. And the other thing to say is, if one's at all active in social media, just follow African voices. There are an incredible wealth. I don't need to tell you this, but notably in Nigeria and Ghana, Twitter is a huge vehicle for expression. And if you want to, and if you are interested, there is just a vast amount of fantastically good commentary and analysis coming out of Africa by Africans. You seriously don't have to rely on the Bolstiftung and folks like that. I mean, they're lovely people and they have great locations in Cape Town, but if you actually do want to kind of follow the flow, it's right there. You literally people will friend you back. I'm now involved in a series of conversations with West African economists on a fairly regular basis. We do live in a world that is more flat in that respect and does allow these kind of communications to take place. And the level of sophistication and on-the-ground expertise is, of course, just immense, and it's far higher. Even if you follow a good global newspaper, the coverage does tend to be driven by crisis. You don't get a good sense of the everyday flow and the coherence. So really, just don't buy this kind of passivity. There's no excuse. Inform yourselves.
Yes, I think that's always a good thing to do. So looking at this past election in Nigeria, just very briefly, again, it appeared that interest in the West was slightly higher, at least in the Anglo press, than it usually would have been, because Peter Obi was this charismatic figure. And this sort of falls, maybe it's a trend, maybe it's just a very small brush fire, into a larger attempt, I think, we see here and there to take Africa more seriously, at least from an institutional perspective. We certainly have a change in the Africa policy coming out of the German Auswärtige Amt for Foreign Office. We now have this very interesting development where the New York Times is trying to exonerate George W. Bush's reputation to a certain extent, sort of putting the AIDS policies he put in place front and center, and saying how many lives he saved, which he did. But Nicholas Kristof would not have written this in 2015, and now there's this attempt to put this history back into the spotlight, maybe also as an attempt to say, maybe we can talk. China seems to be falling away. Maybe there's a conversation to be had on a more respectful basis. So, Obi losing, what do you think does that do in this context for Nigeria? And do you see a larger trend of a more respectful approach, at least institutionally, towards Africa?
Yeah, certainly. There is more. And that comes for probably two large reasons. Firstly, these are now stronger nations. They are strong institutions. We are 60 plus years outside of away from independence. So these nations have been able to build stronger institutions and are now in a position where they realize that they do have some global worth, and they are now showing that. And as you mentioned, the stats are all there. The population growth is at an incredible pace. The average, the median age is around 40 and under at the moment. And we're seeing that, as you, Adam, mentioned, on social media, and the impact of young people using social media to basically kind of spread their messages around the world. One thing that gotten a lot of attention were the End SARS protests in October of 2020, which was a protest by tens of thousands of young people across Nigeria who are protesting what started against police brutality, but then merged into kind of a wider demonstration against corruption. And their ability to use social media to garner attention from around the world was sensational. It was incredible across so many different demographics, to the point where you had not only political institutions feeling the need to comment, but you had sort of, as far as Beyonce feeling the need that she had to say something, because her entire Instagram comments were just filled with Nigerians saying, "We support you, we love your music, now it's sort of, it's time for you to pay back here." And you start to see just the numbers of the ability to use the demographic shift and the population size to have that impact. And so it becomes impossible to ignore when you're able to coalesce around a shared vision. When it comes to Peter Obi, that's a very good question at this point. It's hard to say. The election was just 2 weeks ago, but I think there are a lot of positives to come from this election. You had a scenario. This was only Nigeria's 7th election since the end of military rule. And in that time, a sitting president has been defeated. And in this case, you had 3 candidates. Each of them won the exact same number of states. Peter Obi, it was a third-party candidate who had no ground game, didn't have much money. His entire campaign was basically run by young people who basically said to him, "Yeah, we've got this, don't worry. You just, don't do anything bad between now and the election, and we will basically organically run a campaign for you." And in a country of 200 million people, that's a very, very difficult thing to do. And so for the fact that he was able to then win as many states as the other leading parties, I think will continue to show the power that this young generation have and the influence that they have. And I think that they will, when the sort of disappointment dies down in the coming months, will find a way of using that to sort of further this movement for change. And you now have a president going into office who, he is as weak as any president has. He has probably the smallest mandate of any Nigerian president in history. So I think that will then play a big part moving forward.
And I would like to emphasize it's not just a matter of, as it were, well-wishing, attention to the functioning of democracy and its dynamic, but there is also a systemic responsibility across Africa from side to side, whether you're Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, all right now facing very, very severe financial stress. And all of them in one way or another are in negotiations with the IMF over one form or other of support. The elections in Nigeria were, the stage for this epic, screw-up with the attempt to demonetize large parts of the cash money supply. That's one of the reasons why somebody like myself has to follow the African story at this point, because the financial drama is so significant, A, in the sense of the possibility of sovereign default in several different cases, which is a major, rupture of the financial order. B, because the politics of the international institutions and Western creditors are so acute and really do put us in the crosshairs. Europe, the United States have a responsibility to ensure that the World Bank and the IMF deal with these crisis cases in an appropriate way. And thirdly, because time is running out. Without becoming alarmist about the demographic story, Nigeria has seen a reduction in the per capita level of capital over the last 10 years. So the capital to labor ratio has actually fallen in Nigeria from already a very low level at the beginning of that decade. And with the scale of the demographic shift, right, this huge boom in the African population, where young Africans will essentially dominate the global labor market for young people, it's essential that the investment goes in there, and it will only go in if, in various forms, it's de-risked. And on the other hand, it should only go in if the African states and the African borrowers who take up the credit have conditions under which they can repay. And so this is really a huge urgency. And without that, to go back to the sort of broad rubric of our panel, like democracy has very few chances of succeeding. Like in Ghana, you have promising experiments with free public education, and they lead you directly into a financial impasse and a crisis. That kind of tension is catastrophic for the prospects for democracy anywhere in the world, right? No democracy can function under the kind of pressure that many of the African states are currently under. So negotiating that, and Europe taking a constructive and significant lead. Germany has at various signs shown sign of this. In 2020, Germany, along with the French, were pushing hard for various types of debt relief. This is an urgent responsibility on citizens also in the global north to demand this kind of reaction from their governments. Not in the spirit of charity, but in the sense of solidarity, and also because our collective future depends on it.
All right, I'll allow myself 3 more questions that go into this direction before we push it to the panel, push it to the audience, sorry. So the first is, it would really be a shame if we weren't able, in a situation where the demographic structure is as it is, not to help out, because it's actually a kind of growth model that we understand very well and that has run its course in the European context, but it can be sort of ameliorated by investment. And then staying on this topic of responsibility and a change of thinking in institutions, I think there's 2 really interesting things happening that we need to sort of complete the story that you were telling. And one is this moment of COVID in 2020, where actually the Germans did change their tune quite significantly. So it is possible. Suddenly, we were at a situation where we put the risks on the biggest available balance sheet and saved the day, essentially, at the last hour. And then at the central bank, the realization seems to have come through that while they do not have a dual mandate, they do have a mandate to actually prevent the thing from blowing up, right? So in the end, the question is, can the fragility of the Italian banking system save European democracy, would be then the question, because we need to keep that from collapsing, and that in turn might provide the stability we need to keep our democracies from becoming too fragile to function. So whoever wants to start.
I think this is all you.
Well, the migration issue is definitely, I'd be fascinated to hear, because Nigeria is one of the countries which, according to opinion polling, there's an extraordinary preponderance of folks who would actually quite like to migrate if they had the chance, right? This may be a kind of Afro-pessimist kind of read, but there was I think it was a Pew survey which surveyed global populations as to what percentage of the population would be keen to leave and to move somewhere else, and Nigeria came out very, very high on the list of countries with large populations that would like to emigrate. Does that ring true to you?
No, I noticed that it's risen in the last sort of 10 years from, I think, about 30% to about 60% now of people who would say that they would, who would say if they had the opportunity they would migrate out of the country, and I think that can sort of at the moment largely be put to the current economic crisis going on in the country and the current administration, and so it's something that can certainly shift, and I think would have shifted, quite quickly if Peter Obi had won the election.
Yes, there was that incredible moment. It was reported anyway in the American press when Christian Lindner went to Senegal, apparently, and sat down with a group of Senegalese university students and did the very, very risky thing of asking a group of students for a show of hands, which is something as a professor you would never be foolish enough to do. And he said, right, can we see a show of hands of how many of you would like to emigrate to Germany to work as highly skilled migrants if you could? And not a single hand went up. Not one, not a single hand went up. So at that level, if you're somebody with a promising career in Senegal at this point, Germany does not appear as an attractive option. I think there's work to do on both sides of that equation, obviously, and that was the nub of, I think, the earlier panels. Like, what what kind of negotiation, that's a great phrase you had, Verhandlung, right? What kind of Aushandlung, what kind of Verhandlung would be necessary to actually open that channel? Because it's not there, right? There's skilled labour migration, highly educated people within the EU, but Germany is not an attractive place to move to if you're in that category from the outside. On the broader points, I would just, without getting bogged down in the details of fiscal and monetary policy or, the Italian banking system, I do think that we tell a story of sophisticated learning. I don't find narratives of modern democracy which start from the sort of eternal structural force of assumption X or assumption Y or cultural pattern. I mean, I was mocking a certain sort of faux culturalism with purpose, because I think actually it's profoundly unhelpful for thinking about. You can see why defensively kids in a certain setting would want to define themselves as belonging to a culture and, as it were, to close that, to armor it, to represent it, to face up, to demand respect for it, obviously, right? And I'm speaking from a position of extreme privilege, and I'm fully aware of that, or as aware as I struggle to be as aware as I can of that fact. But nevertheless, as an analytical category, I think it's profoundly unhelpful, because what we actually see is mobility and argument, and even things which count as culture have to be continuously produced and reproduced and upheld and recreated every single day with huge scope for innovation. If you look at, young people in Africa, it's just this massive dynamo of innovation all the time. Without wanting to romanticize it, there is this very potent force there. And we see that even in German thinking about Eurozone fiscal policy. There is indeed a force, and many of us in the room will know people who in Berlin over the last 10 years have done the Lord's work of arguing the case through, of badgering, of lobbying, of embarrassing, calling out, making shameful certain sorts of stupid argument that simply won't work. And it's succeeded. Like it did indeed exactly as you say, and it's about coalitional politics. It's about majorities. It's about the hard work of getting the right people elected at the right time and into the right jobs. And in 2020, we had an SPD-controlled German finance ministry, unlike at the height of the Eurozone, when between 2010 and 2013, it was an FDP-controlled finance ministry, and it was disastrous for the Eurozone. Right, that's why Joe Stiglitz and I made the intervention that we did, as scandalous as many of my colleagues thought it was for outsiders to speak as frankly as we did, because it is indeed dangerous for Europe to have the wrong people in control of the German finance ministry at important moments. So yes, there is learning, it does happen, but it has to be sustained, the pressure has to be kept up, we have to keep moving the frontier, and there are moments where drama and crisis can be very productive. But actually, having spoken to Olaf Scholz about the Italian situation, he was finance minister at the moment when the Italian situation was brewing up before 2020, and I know for a fact that his preference was to keep the lid on it, not to exacerbate the situation, to avoid escalating the crisis, because, as a solid citizen of the social democratic side of German politics, he's deeply concerned about Italian fascism. For real. And the same is true of Habeck as well. Both of them, when they think about the Italian situation, go to the fascist history. And that is extremely healthy, I think, as a kind of check on European politics. The nightmare is that you end up doing these dirty deals, right? You end up doing these horrible bargains where you end up bailing out banks, like the headline says. They saved Wall Street to save Main Street. We are, in a sense, hostages, whether we like it or not. And this is also, of course, long been the tragedy of social democracy. And a revolutionary left would say, well, then you have to change the entire system to avoid this blackmail. It would be nice if we had the chance to do that. Short of that, what you clearly do have to do is to push structural change, structural reform, so that the system is safer and so that the occasions on which you fall into positions of blackmail are reduced. And that has to be the agenda of change. But to go back to a big kind of overarching question, what is, and you and I were discussing this over lunch, let us not imagine, and I feel this is one of the really unhealthy tendencies in a certain sort of German discussion about Ordnungspolitik, let us not imagine that capitalism really is susceptible to Ordnung. That's a kind of pious hope that a certain sort of relatively, truly kind of provincial economic thinking will perpetuate over and over again, not entirely by coincidence from Freiburg. In Freiburg, it may seem as though you can end history and give it an order, but I swear, if you're in Cape Town, if you're in Lagos, if you're in Hong Kong, if you're in New York, even if you're in London, it doesn't feel as though this is a thing that can be given that kind of shape. In other words, we have to continuously work continuously politicize, continuously debate, open things up, and force, institutional change over and over and over again. There is no end to this tunnel. I mean, I describe it as an endless tightrope walk. You mean we're never getting off this thing? It's just going to be one crisis after another, essentially.
All right, you have been our hostages long enough. So let's do 3 questions at a time, and then we'll see if we can do another round.
This astonishing and bright presentations for both speakers. My name is Ivan, and I want to make a kind of a remarks/questions towards what Adam presented, but I would like to be this remarks/questions also questions to both of the speakers. And you, Adam, posed 2 facts that after the deflation actually come to power Hitler. Yes. And we know that basically the very existence of 2 facts does not lead the causality, doesn't lead a logical consequence. I can more speculatively reverse this argument and say maybe hyperinflation 10, 15 years ago came Hitler in power, comparing it, for example, to hyperinflation in Russia that leads to racism right now. So my first remark was, could you please maybe shortly bring in the reason for causality in this regard? And the second remark was about unemployment, or why do we so much worry about rates of unemployment? A long time thinking that we confusing mistakenly the very problem. The problem is not that person or a portion of persons in the society doesn't have a job to perform. The real problem is that those persons are intimidated by the death of starvation or the death on the streets by kicking away from their homes. The problem is that they do not have sure resources to survive, but not the job to perform. And maybe we should reformulate and imagine the society where these basic rights are guaranteed through the basic income or through another instruments, and therefore we wouldn't consider the unemployment in itself as a problem, because those persons, the most vulnerable persons, can dedicate not to perform a job, but to education, to thinking of how we can reformulate society, whatsoever. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for both speeches. It was really interesting, and my question goes to Dipo, because I think we in Europe, we have a really paternalistic view of Africa. You mentioned it. We are thinking of poverty. We are thinking, why are these Africans electing dictators again and again? Why are these civil wars in Africa? And you mentioned also this history, 1884, this conferences in Berlin. So what is also the duty and the responsibility of Europe in this sense? So what has to be changed also in the Europe view? But you mentioned also this deal between the UK and Rwanda, but it has nothing changed in the view of the Europeans? So this would be really interesting. Thank you.
Should we go this too?
Maybe can we take one more?
I've got 3 questions.
All right, so we have the causality between hyperinflation and unemployment and UBI, and then we have the question of, have the Europeans changed, or are they up to their old tricks?
Yeah, okay. No, it's a great question, let me just give you a very stylized version. So it's not by accident, I think, that there are after all. So there's an inflationary burst after World War I, and that does actually give rise to the failure of one regime, which is the Italian liberal parliamentary system and the rise of fascism there. And 10 years later, we see deflation leading to the rise of National Socialism. And to my mind, this actually stylized, and furthermore, we know there are really very significant differences between Italian fascism and the Nazi movement. And I think those can be causally linked to the nature of the underlying problem. So inflation, quintessentially, is a story of distributional struggle, right? That's what's driving the price. And so it's a situation that does, in fact, produce revolutionary circumstances. And it produces a form of fascism, which in the case of Italian fascism is, in the most crude and literal sense, almost conforming to the Comintern definition of what fascism is, an anti-revolutionary tool. They are the hired squads for the purpose of destroying the socialist movement, the Marxist, the communist movement in Italy that produced the Biennio Rosso, the actual occupation of factories, the true nightmare of any bourgeoisie, right? So Italian fascism emerges out of that logic. Italy is experiencing a rapid inflation too, and there was a moment in which something like that would have been possible in Germany, but for a complicated, different reason, I'm sure that Mikhail talked about, the powers that be in the Weimar Republic stabilized the situation in 23. Because inflations are also a way of answering the question of who pays for what, right? And in the German case, the urgent issue to decide was who pays for the war. The moment in which the Nazis come to power is also significant in shaping the sort of movement that they are. Because much as they imagine themselves to be a street-fighting, quasi-revolutionary force, we all know it's actually kind of cosplay. I mean, people do get killed, but nowhere near as many as during the genuinely civil war conditions of Germany in the early 1920s, when thousands of people are killed, right? And there's literally street fighting, there's the Red Army of the Ruhr, there are tanks, there are aircraft, there are machine guns being used. Nothing like that in the early 1930s. It's a weird, eerie kind of replay. And furthermore, the way that Hitler comes to power is this sort of backwards gear. He's sort of shuffled into power. What are the kind of conditions that create that kind of vacuum of power almost, in which you're not occupying factories because everyone's already been kicked out of the factories, they're unemployed? It's a deflation which does that. A deflation demobilizes social forces. It renders the business community in Germany essentially impotent. Right? This is one of the fundamental misunderstandings of the logic of 32-33 in the old school, simple-minded Marxist camp, is there aren't a lot of Drahtzieher, of string pullers, because basically their leverage, by comparison with the early 1920s, is minimal. German business in the early 20s is genuinely calling the shots. 10 years later, it's fundamentally, in quite profound ways, disempowered. The same is true for the organized labor movement. In the early 20s, you have genuine revolutionary movement. In the early 1930s, the KPD is a party of unemployed people. Right? Unemployed men, in particular, engaged in street fighting as a sort of surrogate activity for the revolution they can no longer conduct. So those are the ways in which, for me, and Hitler takes power by some sort of weird, not revolutionary strategy, but electoral means with a bunch of backroom manipulating, which goes on behind the scenes and fails. So that is the way, to me, in which causally the two different political economies line up with two different sorts of struggle. One is very much conditioned by class struggle, distributional struggle. That's the early 20s, and that's what Italian fascism looks like. It's a class struggle party. And the early 1930s is something weirder, created in the vacuum of power, created by an implosion. You can also think in terms of logics of governance that follow. The early 1920s fascist party in Italy is an Austerian, conservative, liberal, budget-slashing strong arm of a certain sort of conservative liberalism. In the early 1930s, the Nazis can actually assimilate Keynesian economics, and because you're in a deflated situation, actually make everyone better off. Even the German working class is better off, in the vast majority, those who are not racially excluded or politically persecuted, because they can use state stimulus to achieve a huge leap forward. So those are the way causally in which I think these two different conjunctures shape the sort of political movements you get in those two periods. Two different crises of democracy as a result.
Just to answer sort of take on your second point, I think if you're sort of interested in that sort of process of reimagining societies as well, there's lots of very interesting stuff going on across Africa at the moment, from lots of young people who are really trying to shift this idea of, what sort of political systems are best for us, what sort of social structures are best for us. Traditionally, the one you picked in sort of the cases of many of the sort of quote-unquote founding fathers, the independence heroes, was based on your allegiance to which country, whether it was the Soviet Union or the US. So there are lots of really interesting stuff happening across the continent in that. And then to your question, kind of what are the shifts of what's changed? It's really a generational one. So, for example, in the UK now, this deal between the UK and Rwanda basically saying, we will send illegal migrants to Rwanda,
is playing on this sort of stereotypical notion of being sent to Africa as a punishment. It is this terrible, horrible place, and should you go there, it's, you know, it's a horrible thing. I mean, Rwanda really is a great country. You know, it really is a huge success story, a really wonderful place that many, you know, that for many reasons is, for a lot of people, it's better, but it plays to that stereotype, and it's really what that. And so it's for that generation, and they're playing. The government are playing to their voters, the conservative voters, who, you know, tend to be over 50, and so who have those stereotypes. It doesn't work for younger voters, and it doesn't work for younger people. And that same arguments were happening during the BLM protests around issues of things like statues and you know, who are the figures that we should celebrate from our past. So, you know, that shift is really a generational one, and also for those who are genuinely, regardless of age, curious of an accurate telling of history and the work of memory and how we should remember these incidences of the past.
All right, so I'm getting signals that unfortunately we are running out of time. I'm sure that Adam will be happy to answer the UBI question over coffee. We've learned that, you know, most things can be solved with education, which is nice, be it a gap, you know, within our elites or be it in the general population. Education is the answer. We're at the right place for that. Thank you very much. I think that wraps it up now.